which won't be long now. I've got to link all these things. It's not so automatic, so we're going to make sure it's all linked and working. So I think we're right and going now. So guys, I hope you're well. I'm Jeff. I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. We ran our vineyard or biodynamically and organically, and then we run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less. So we're quite a sustainable little label. We do things like we use low carbon glass, and we have solar on the winery. You know, I would love to ultimately take the winery completely off the grid. At the moment, our the technology and batteries aren't quite there yet, and so we're doing a little bit of work with some geothermal people, and hopefully that will buffer us and allow us to take the winery off the grid. So the ultimate goal is to be, completely off the grid winery. If you are just joining us, I've seen a couple of new people clicking on as we're speaking. I'm just saying everyone can talk in these sessions now. Like previously in the webinars, you've only been able to type in on the chat, but now everyone can talk, and all you need to do is hold your finger down on the space bar, which will unmute you, and you can ask your questions or tell me how much you like the wine or don't like the wine, and then you take your finger off the space bar and it will mute you out again. So it saves that background noise. So as I was saying, yeah, we're quite a boutique winery. We're quite a sustainable winery. We're about an hour and a half south of Sydney in a region called the Southern Highlands. A lot of people think that we're fairly warm climate because we're so close to Sydney, but our lowest vineyard in the Highlands is 500 meters. So we're quite cool. And quite often we're harvesting after Tasmania, which shows you how cold we are. But we're not here to talk about how cold we are and our sustainability. We're here to taste the wine. So let's taste the wines. So I get it's a bit hard for me because I've got to watch like new attendees coming in and so I think we're all up and running. But so guys, we're first going to look at our Sauvignon Blanc, and what we're going to do is actually we're going to pretty much follow that tasting notes that you have down the list. Now, one of those bottles is a 500 ml bottle, so there's enough in there for 2 people to taste. If you try and keep up with me drinking the whole 50 ml bottle, you may struggle. Most people will probably either be sharing it with someone or they do half a bottle with me and save the half a bottle for afterwards. The other thing is pretty much there's a bit of a story and a bit of conversation about all the wines as we go on. So just because I start talking about the next wine doesn't mean you have to jump onto it straight away. So you've got plenty of time to taste the wines, and you can just sort of move through at your own pace. So the first one we go look at is our Sauvignon Blanc. Normally I would be enjoying the wines with you, which is one of the great things about these virtual tastings is, I don't have to drive home after the cellar door, but I've got a few of these virtual tastings to do tonight. So for this session, I'm just staying on the waters for a little bit. So we're gonna look at Sauvignon Blanc first. I'm actually generally not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I usually find them like really fruity and over the top and a bit too much. And so I make this in what we call a fumé style. And it's a style that originates out of Bordeaux in France and essentially means a Sauvignon Blanc that has been fermented using oak. And what that oak does is it kind of mellows out all the flavors and adds a nice little bit of texture to it. And, it's a softer, more round version of the Sauvignon Blancs that we're used to drinking. I guess there's a couple of interesting things we do for our Sauvignon Blanc. One of them is we do a double pick. And so we harvest half of it at around about 9 Beaumet. Now, Beaumet is a sugar level. So similar to temperature, we've got degrees Celsius, we've got degrees Fahrenheit, we've got degrees Kelvin. There's all these different measures of temperature. The same with sugar. We've got Baumets and Brixes and specific gravities and Olschlers and all these different things. But I use Beaumet. The reason I use Beaumet is because if I take 1 Beaumet of sugar and I ferment it with a yeast into alcohol, I end up with 1% of alcohol. So it's just a really nice, easy conversion from one to the other. And so throughout this afternoon, if you hear me talking about Beaumet or alcohol, they're pretty much interchangeable with each other. So this Sauvignon Blanc, we harvest half of it at 9 Beaumet, and that gives us that really nice crisp, fresh acid and that green appley character and a little bit of lantana in the wine. We then wait 1 or 2 weeks and we harvest the second half at around about that 12.5 to 13% alcohol. And that gives us that really nice passion fruit and tropical characters of the wine. We then ferment it all in oak, and that gives you that ending to the end of that wine. You get that really nice, it's like a textural feel in the mouth that lingers around. The oak also mellows out all the flavors a bit, so you don't get this sort of really intense fruit flavor just in your face. It's like a mellowed out version. And the interesting thing is too, when you smell it to begin with, you get that sort of vanilla lift from the oak, which, you know, it makes it smell like it could be a little bit sweet, but then it's not. It's actually quite a dry wine. So, you know, this for me is the style of Sauvignon Blanc that I like. It's sort of a mellowed, more chilled out, a little bit more textural style of Sauvignon Blanc. It's something that's quite different. If you happen to have a cheese plate in front of you and you've got something like an Edam or Jarlsberg or something like that, that's a really great match for this wine. Those tropical flavors we get in it is a really good example of how cold we are in the Highlands. You know, as I said, we sometimes harvest after Tasmania. So we're quite a cold region, even though we're so close to Sydney. And that makes varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, they make them the main varieties in our region, similar to the Yarra Valley. Because we are so cold, we're quite well known for our Pinot Gris in the Highlands. And I always have people coming into cellar door asking me, what's the difference between a Grigio and a Gris? And so I decided I'm going to make the difference. So we're going to slowly move on to our Grigio and then onto our Gris. They're both made from the exact same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Pinot Grigio is the way the Italians do it, and Pinot Gris is the way the French do it. Now, the first big difference we see is actually the winemaking philosophies. So the Italians, to an extent, you could say that Italians make everything specifically for a food. I mean, that's not 100% true, but the Italians are definitely very conscious of food when they're making their wine. And as such, it creates a different style of wine. The French, on the other hand, it's all about the wine. All they're caring about is the wine itself. And so we end up with these two very different styles. If you think about Italy, there's a lot of maritime climate, a lot of seafood down there. It's warmer temperatures. And so they're trying to create something that's zippy and fresh and steely and crisp. And so the first thing the Italians do is they harvest it nice and early. So they're harvesting it at around about that 11 to 12% alcohol level. Because as we ripen a grape, what happens is our sugar levels slowly go up and our acid levels slowly go down. So if we want to harvest something where it's nice and fresh and crisp, we harvest it nice and early, and that's got that higher acid level. So this is the first thing the Italians do, is they're harvesting it nice and early. The second thing is the Italians are not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I press the juice off into a tank, and then when it's in the tank, I fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank and I tip it in the top of the tank, and I fill it from the bottom and I tip it in the top. And I might do that 10 or 20 or 30 times until all the juice goes all brown. And once the juice is all brown, I do a very long, slow, cold ferment. And that helps get me that green apple character and those fresh pears and that really steely, crisp palate to the wine. One of the difficult things with Italian styles and Italian winemaking as well is it's really easy in a cellar door situation where you don't have food or anything to just breeze over these wines. Because they are designed to go with food, they really require a bit of attention when you're tasting them, or they require a bit of food when you're tasting them to really see the flavors and the textures they have. One of my favorite matches with this Pinot Grigio, down the south coast, they do these great little oysters, and they're quite a sweet little oyster. But you know, when you taste that wine now, you get these sort of fresh pear and apple characters to it. When you have an oyster and then taste this wine, you get all these savory, sort of yeasty, cheesy, lanolin type flavors to it, which you don't taste at all in the wine at the moment. And this is a perfect example of what Italian styles can do, is that there's all these flavors hidden in that wine that come out at different times, at different temperatures, at different food matches. And so if you don't have those there, when you just taste the wine, you can breeze over them quite easily. And this is a wine where if you were to keep that wine on your desk for the rest of the evening and go back and taste it every, half hour or so, as that wine warms up and changes, it will release all these different aromas into the air. And so you'll taste different flavors and different aromas at different times. And it's one of the cool things that these Italian styles do. It's probably easy to compare it when we move on to the Gris. So I'll sort of jump back and forward between the Gris and the Grigio for a little bit, so you don't have to jump straight to the Gris next. But Pinot Gris is the French way of doing it. So they're both made from the same variety, which is the Pinot Gris variety. Pinot Grigio is Italian, Pinot Gris is French. So if you think about France and Pinot Gris, most of Pinot Gris in France is grown on the French-German border in Alsace. So it's quite a cool climate region. The French are all about the wine. So they're trying to create something that's big and round and robust and voluptuous style of wine. So the first thing they do is they harvest it a lot later. So the Italians are harvesting 11, 12% alcohol. The French are harvesting at about 13 to 14% alcohol. So a lot more alcohol to the wine. And this is where we see the first difference. And if you look at your wine, and you might see it a little bit easier, you're definitely not going to see it in mine because it's not real wine. But if you look in your bottles even, you might see it, the color difference between the Grigio and the Gris. And you'll see in that Gris, it's kind of got this bronzy color to it. Sometimes you even get a little hint of pinkiness. And that's because of the ripeness level. So Pinot Gris is a really interesting variety. It's a white variety, but when it gets to a really high ripeness level, it starts developing a bit of pink color on the skins. And it's actually where the name comes from. So when the French are getting up around about that high 12s, early 13s for the alcohol and Beaumet, the skins get the pink color on them, and those hanging bunches on the vines of all those pink skins, they get a little light dusting of yeast over the top. And when you see those bunches from the distance, they actually look gray. And the French word for gray is gris. And the name comes from Pinot because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. So it's one of the cousins of those varieties. And Gris because the bunches look gray on the grapevines. Now, the Italians never see that gray color because they're harvesting it really early when the bunches are still green or a little bit yellowy. But the French always wait for it to get a lot riper, and so they're getting that gray color on the vines. But as a result, we always end up with this sort of bronzy, bit pinky color sometimes in the wine itself. So that's one of the first big differences between the wines. One of the next things you'll notice, if you look at your glass, just around here above the wine, you end up with a rim of clear liquid, which is then dribbling back down into wine at the bottom. And we call this the legs of the wine. And what it essentially is all the volatile components in that wine evaporate out. They condensate on the glass up here, and then they dribble back down into the glass. Now, the volatile components of a wine are anything in that wine that can evaporate at room temperature. Now, this is pretty much predominantly alcohol. And the reason we really don't see this rim of clear liquid in the Grigio is because it's got a much lower percentage alcohol, whereas Gris has that high 13 to 14% alcohol. So we really see that rim around there. And this does something really interesting to the wine. If you were to smell that wine, maybe give it a bit of a swirl and have a smell of it as well, you would probably say to me that that wine is a lot more aromatic than the Grigio, definitely jumping out of the glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aroma compounds of that Grigio and the aroma compounds of that Gris, the Grigio actually has loads more aroma to it. And what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of that wine, it's grabbing on to all the other aroma compounds with it and it's pulling it out. And so when we smell it, we get this hit of all the aroma compounds. And this is the key thing between Grigio and Gris. Grigio, there's all these hidden aroma compounds that come out at different times or with different food. Gris, because of this alcohol, it brings it all out at once. So pretty much what you see in this glass is what you get. If you try that with different foods or let it sit on the table for a little bit of time and warm up, it really doesn't change that much. It really is, this is it, this is what you get. And so that alcohol has a massive effect on the aromas. And the thing is, a lot of people don't realize that we talk about these pear flavors and all these different characters. We're not actually tasting those. So we can only taste sugar, sweetness, sour, bitter, salty, and I think it's umami or something. So we can only taste these feelings, but when we smell raspberry, or when we think we're tasting pear, whatever it is, it's actually when the wine goes down the back of the throat here, the aroma compounds become volatile and they become airborne, and we're actually smelling it. So we need those aroma compounds to be airborne to be able to taste them. For the Gris, all those aroma compounds are made airborne by the alcohol. For the Grigio, different aroma compounds are made airborne depending on the temperature of that wine, depending on what that wine is paired with and what other elements are like in a cheese or in a bit of seafood or something. And so that's why we've got this bigger range of aroma compounds when we're tasting and eating a Grigio versus when we just smell a Gris. The next thing you'll notice in the Gris when you have a taste, it's big and round and voluptuous. And one of the key things is it's kind of got this oily character to it, like a viscosity. And that viscosity is what we call a glycerol. And if I take a grape that's really ripe, like the Gris is at that 13 to 14% alcohol level, it's really ripe, and I ferment it at a really warm temperature, it creates this mouthful, it creates glycerols that gives me this mouthfeel character. The problem with fermenting warm is we lose aroma. So the Italians are fermenting really cold and they end up with less mouthfeel, but a lot more aroma. The French are fermenting warm, so they get more mouthfeel, more viscosity and that oiliness, but they're losing aroma. So the French, to try and trap in that aroma, they do everything under carbon dioxide. So they're super afraid of oxygen. And so, you know, if I'm transferring this wine from one tank to another or transferring the juice from one tank to another, it's all done under carbon dioxide cover. So we end up with these really two amazingly different wines. You've got your Grigio at this end of the spectrum, and you've got your Gris at this end of the spectrum. And these wines are from the exact same vineyard, exact same block, and the only difference between them is about 2 or 3 weeks harvest difference and the winemaking technique. So it's a really good example of what the winemaker and the viticulturist can do to affect the final wine. So we end up with these two very different wines. And one of the things that is confusing in Australia is, you can imagine we've got all the variations in between, plus this funny crossover section. So Gris and Grigios in Australia are really confusing. To add to this confusion, if you go into a bottle shop or anywhere at the matter, the terms Grigio and the terms Gris are not controlled by labeling law. So it can be a little bit of a lucky dip, you know, what you're going to get. And I've worked previously for big companies and we'll make a Gris or a Grigio, and depending on what the marketing team thinks will sell better for that specific month, the exact same wine will be labeled either Gris or Grigio. And so it makes it really hard for us as consumers what we're getting. there's a couple of things you can do. One of them is you can turn the bottle around and look at the alcohol. If it's around 11 to 12% alcohol, it's going to be a Grigio style. If it's 13 to 14% alcohol, it's going to be a Gris style. Unfortunately, a lot of them are between that 12 to 13% alcohol. And in that area, it really depends on what the winemaker did as to where it's going to sit in the scheme of things. This is starting to change a little bit. So probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I entered a wine in a wine show, I'd enter it as a wine made from the Pinot Gris grape. Now, when I enter wine in a wine show, I enter it as a Grigio or a Gris. So if I was, for example, to take that Grigio, which is a beautiful Grigio, and enter it into a Pinot Gris class, it will get 0 marks because it's not a Pinot Gris. So what will happen now over the next sort of 3 to 5 years is the wine shows will clearly define what makes a Grigio and what makes a Gris. And from there, eventually, we'll probably end up with that in labeling law. And so one day we'll be able to walk into a bottle shop and we'll be able to go, oh yeah, that's definitely going to be a Grigio and that's definitely going to be a Gris. But everyone pretty much around the world, except for Europe, is going through a very similar thing. You know, wines in New Zealand and in America, Gris and Grigios, they have that same problem. And the reason it's so defined in Europe is not so much because of the styles, but because of what we call the appellation control laws in Europe. So in Europe, if you want to get the stamp of approval from the French government or the stamp of approval from the Italian government, you have to follow these what are called appellation control laws. And these appellation laws actually tell you how you must make the wine. So even though the term Gris and Grigio isn't defined over there, to be a Gris appellation wine, you must make it with high alcohol, no oxygen, warm ferments. If to get that Grigio appellation seal of approval, you must do lower alcohol, zippy crisp wine. And so by default over in Europe, they've defined these Grigio and Gris styles, but they're actually defining it based on their region and laws rather than the actual style. And so we're trying to do the reverse in Australia. We don't have these regional laws on how to make wine. So we're trying to define these terms Grigio and Gris based on a style. So it takes a bit more time, but we are getting there slowly. One day, I always get these people in the cellar door and couples coming in, and one of them likes a Grigio and one of them likes a Gris, and they can never decide which one they like the best. And so, which is fine by me because it means they end up buying 2 bottles instead of 1. So I don't have a problem with that at all. One of the cool things about Gris and Grigio, wines are often really hard to find a wine that matches with spicy food, and Gris and Grigios are my go-to. So if I'm having like Vietnamese or Thai or anything that's really fresh and spicy, I'll have that with a Grigio. If I'm having something like an Indian that's a bit more creamy and robust and spicy, I'll often have that with a Gris. So they're good go-to wines for those more spicy foods. So guys, next, I was just going to say, I can do polling on this. I should do a polling because I've never done it before this as well. Now I've done it. I've just opened all these screens. I might not do a polling. Anyway, you can do polling on this. Normally what I do is ask people, if they drink Chardonnay at all. And I'm always interested to see, because whenever I ask this question on our private Zoom meetings or in the cellar door, I reckon I get about 80% of people saying, oh, yeah, I sort of drink Chardonnay maybe. And then 20% people saying, yeah, I drink Chardonnay, definitely. And the funny thing is that the biggest selling white variety in Australia and the biggest selling white variety in our cellar door is Chardonnay, even though only 20% of people say they drink Chardonnay. And so I have this theory that we all must be closet Chardonnay drinkers in Australia or something. I think maybe it's because of Kath and Kim. Maybe we don't want to admit that we drink Chardonnay. I don't know. Maybe they scarred us a bit. I actually think it's because of the history of Chardonnay. So in Australia, we sort of went from early 70s and 80s. We had these super oaky, buttery Chardonnays. And then we went to the late 90s early 2000s, we had these like super fruity Chardonnays, and we all have these memories of something that was either too fruity or too oaky or too buttery that we don't really like or we weren't sure about, and that sort of jaded us a little bit in that Chardonnay market. For me, Chardonnay is all about balance. I want to see a little bit of oak. I want to see a little bit of butteriness. I want to see a little bit of fruit, but I don't want to see any of those flavors overpowering other flavor. I want to see them in all this nice balance. Um, Chardonnay is a really fun variety for a winemaker to make. It's almost like a blank canvas. Every tiny little thing I do as a winemaker, we can really taste it in the final wine. For that Pinot Gris and Grigio, for those differences, they were really big winemaking differences to make those different wines. If I was to do a really tiny little subtle difference between them, you wouldn't taste it in the Pinot Gris and Grigio because the characters of the fruit would overpower it. With Chardonnay, for whatever reason, it's very malleable. And so those tiny little things that we do different is really obvious in the final wine. It means it's a fun wine to make. It can be a scary wine to make because, you know, if you do a little thing that's wrong, it can be very obvious in the final wine. So Chardonnays is one of those white varieties that is seen to be a bit of a pinnacle of winemaking because of that, is because every little thing you can see at the end is very obvious. So this Chardonnay for me, you know, it's got that nice little bit of oak, not overpowered because we don't use any new oak. You get that little bit of butteriness, and then you get that sort of mango character, which rolls onto like grapefruits and citrus characters at the end. And so it's got all that nice balance to it. If you happen to have in front of you maybe a nice fromage dauphinois or a triple brie, that's a great match for this wine. So what you do is you take a sip of the wine and you get that oak and that little bit of butteriness and that mangoes and then those grapefruits and citrus, and then take a bite of your triple brie and then take another sip of the wine, and you'll find that all that butteriness and all those mango flavors of the wine are really enhanced, and they meld really nicely with that brie. And it's a great, nice, one of my favorite little food matches there. And those buttery flavors are something that's really quite interesting. They're actually from a second ferment. So when we make wine, we put all wine through the primary ferment, which is a yeast ferment. It's probably the most important part of the process because it's what creates our alcohol. And the yeast will take the sugar and it will ferment it into alcohol. And at the same time, we get some flavor changes and development with that. So that's probably the most important part of the process. For our Chardonnay and for our red wines, we actually put them through a secondary ferment, which we call a malolactic fermentation. And it's a bacterial ferment. And this bacteria takes the malic acid, which is the same acid that you find in apple, and it converts it into lactic acid, which is the same acid you find in milk. So it's a softer, rounder acid. A byproduct of this fermentation process with the bacteria are these buttery flavors that we see in Chardonnays. And it was the middle of the 80s, and I can't remember if it was like James Halliday or Max Allen or one of those guys. They wrote this article basically saying, oh, I am so sick and tired of these buttery Chardonnays. And as a result, the companies that grow these bacteria started selecting against buttery flavor. So now when I go out and buy a commercially available strain of bacteria, I don't get much of this buttery flavor, if at all. So I get a very, very low level. So what we've done with this wine is we found like an heirloom style bacteria, like an older strain of bacteria, and we use 5% of that in our barrels. And you just get enough of that butteriness. So for me, you know, that butteriness in the Chardonnay is definitely obvious, but it's not over the top. And you can imagine that's only 5%. So imagine back in the 80s, we had 100% of our barrels in the 80s with that same bacteria. You can see why, you know, this wine writer at the time said, oh no, it's too buttery, because it would have overpowered everything. So for me, that's a great example of some of the Chardonnays we're doing in Australia now. And I just hope to try and get people back on the Chardonnay bandwagon, because I actually think that Australians are making some of the best Chardonnays we've ever made now, because we've sort of learnt from these oaky characters, and we learnt from these buttery Chardonnays, and we've learnt from these fruity ones, and now winemakers across Australia as a whole are making these really nice balanced Chardonnays. And I think that it's unfortunate that Chardonnay is not trendy at the moment. I know we're selling loads of it, but it'd be cool to talk about these styles a bit more in the general public, because we are making some fantastic Chardonnays in Australia right now. So that's our Chardonnay. Great match for like a creamy brie. Also a good match. I like it for like oily fish, like salmon and that sort of thing. So next, we're going to move on to our Riesling. Please, guys, if any of you happen to have a rosé, let me know. Chuck it up in the chat or something. We did change over from our Riesling to our rosé in the last couple of weeks because we run out of rosé. So I'm going to talk about Riesling. But if any of you have rosé, I will also talk about the rosé as well. Unfortunately, we've sold out of our rosé now. So if you do have it, you're one of the lucky last people to get it. So we actually do a couple of Rieslings. We do a dry Riesling and a semi-dry Riesling. I was tossing up which one to include in the tasting. And, you know, Australia does a lot of great dry Rieslings, but we don't really do that many sweet Rieslings. And predominantly in Australia, what we see is the sweeter style wines are coming from big companies. And when I'm making a batch of, say, 100,000 litres of Riesling that I want sweet, and that ferment starts, it's impossible to stop. It's like me standing in front of a truck to try and hold it back. I just can't do it. It's not going to happen. And so when you're doing that big scale of fermentation, you ferment it dry and then you back add sweetness. And as a result, you end up with this kind of like sugary, cloying sweetness to the wine. And predominantly a lot of big companies make sweet wines in Australia. So predominantly that's probably the sweeter styles we're used to. When you're making it in a more traditional German style or Italian style, these sweet wines, you're actually doing smaller batches. So we're only doing, say, up to 5,000 litres at a time. What it means is we start the ferment off, and then when we get to the sugar level that we want that wine to be at, we chill it and filter it and stop the ferment. We can't do that with a big batch, but we can do it with a small batch. And what it means is when we have that sweetness to the wine, it's actual natural sweetness and natural acid. So it's different types of sugars and different types of acids that's in that wine, versus when we add sugars and sweeteners after, we've got different flavors to that. So these traditional techniques create these wines where the sweetness is sort of luscious and juicy, and it's like really, like, he really wants you to taste a bit more. It's this fresh sweetness, and it's a little bit, you know, like when you bite into an apple is, you know, really tastes quite fresh, but it actually has a huge amount of sugar. But because it's natural sugar in a natural balance with its natural acids, we get this real fresh feeling and taste to it. And that's the same when you make a wine with these traditional German techniques on a small scale. You're retaining this natural sweetness and you're retaining these natural acids, and you end up with this more luscious style of wine. And so that's why I wanted to include this Riesling in the lineup. You know, in Australia, we would be so easy for us to grab that wine and put it towards the end and call it a dessert wine or a sweet wine. But I actually think that this wine, as an aperitif, you know, with some antipasta, or with a really nice sort of pear salad or some sort of salad with fruit in it, would be a beautiful match at the beginning of the meal, especially on a warm day. It's definitely not warm up here at the moment, but in those sort of warmer weather and warmer conditions, that this chilled Riesling with something nice and fresh at the beginning of the meal, I think, is something that would be really quite nice. So I really wanted to include this in the lineup because it is it's a really good example of a German style Riesling with that sweet, luscious sort of sweet character to it. So that's our white wines. For me in the Highlands, I'm not sure where you guys are, probably from all over Australia, and some of you might be in warm regions, some might be in cold regions. Definitely cold for us here in the Southern Highlands, and so I'm drinking a lot of red wines at the moment. And so the first red wine we're going to look at tonight is something fairly special to me. It's called the Lost Flock. Now, when I was developing this wine, I was sitting in front of the fire at home, and I was drinking a big Barossa Red. And I love those big Barossa Reds. You know, they've got that velvety tannin, those chocolate characters, those wrong raspberry aftertaste. So I was drinking a big Barossa Red, but I can have a glass or two of those, and I just find them too heavy and too much. And I wanted to create something that had that same velvety tannin and that same little chocolate character and that same sort of raspberry aftertaste, but I could drink the bottle of in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle of wine by themselves, but that may have been why I made it originally. It was I just wanted something a bit more delicate. And so I came up with this blend. It's a GSM, so Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre, but it also has a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot in it. And this is just my everyday, open a bottle in front of the fire. It's got these beautiful tannins and soft tannins and raspberry aftertaste. It's my everyday drinking red. It's probably the wine I drink the most of. It's definitely the wine I take to dinner parties the most because, you know, some people like Shiraz and some people like Merlot and some people like Grenache and you know, but if you take a blend, everyone can find one flavor in that wine they like. And so that's why I take this wine to dinner parties the most. The Lost Flock is also a wine that's really special to us, and that's mainly because of the name. So when you choose to go biodynamic or organic, you're doing it from a really philosophical point of view. If I was to example make a Shiraz and put it in a bottle shop, and the bottle shop, the market might value it at say $30. If I then make a biodynamic Shiraz or an organic Shiraz and put it in the bottle shop, the market still only values that at $30. So at the moment, there's no greater value for going biodynamic and or organic in the market sense. It's starting to change a little bit, but at the moment, we don't get any value. When you're running a vineyard biodynamically or organically, it's really expensive. And your biggest expense is actually managing the grass. And so for an industrial vineyard, usually what you do is herbicide all the grass or herbicide a couple of strips underneath the grapevines and then just mow the bit. And so it makes it a lot cheaper and easier to run. For biodynamics and organics, because we can't use herbicide, we're doing a lot of mowing and a lot of cultivating and sometimes whippersnipping up to the edge. So it becomes really, really labor intensive. It really be a labor intensive to manage the grass at all. I just had a question about whether I would taste a red differently to a white. Not necessarily. Temperature wise, perhaps. From a wine judging point of view, we try and judge whites at around about that 18-degree mark and then judge reds at around about that 22-degree mark. But that's not how I drink wine myself. You know, if I'm having a white wine, it's usually on a warm day, so I'm having it a lot colder. If I'm having a red wine, it's usually on a cold day, so I'm having it warmer. And so you get quite different flavors depending on the temperature. For me, the way that you should be tasting wines is the way that you would naturally drink them in your own home. I'm a big believer that I make a wine for people to enjoy it. I don't make a wine for me to tell you that you should enjoy it or tell you how to enjoy it. And so it's important for me that you guys drink the wines that you would normally the way you would normally drink them, because that's how you enjoy it. And for me, that's the most important part of wines, is enjoying it the way you're enjoying it. For reds and whites, when I'm tasting it in a judging scenario, it's a bit different because I'm trying to make sure that all my parameters are the same for all the wines and there's no personal influence that's coming in. And so we do set these temperature guides and things, but I would definitely, for me, I chill my whites. I usually bring them out of the fridge about an hour before I drink them. And then for the reds, it's usually at room temperature unless the temperature is pretty warm or cold. But I reckon just drink it taste it the way you're going to drink it. Lost Flock, that's right. So tasting the Lost Flock, you know, potentially let it warm up a bit. Yes, when wines do warm up, you do get a lot more aroma out of the wines. And so it does tell you a bit more that's in the wine. But if that's essentially not the way you're going to drink it anyway, then it doesn't matter. You should just taste it the way you're going to drink it. So this expense I was talking about of the vineyard is running through and labor costs for the grass. And for, I think it was 2013, we had a caterpillar problem in our vineyard. And the biodynamic philosophy says if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough sheep, or not, sorry, not enough sheep, don't have enough animals. And so we started experimenting with sheep. And first we tried Dorpers. I thought, Dorpers, they'll be great because their wool will shed and we won't have to shear them and they'll be easy to manage. Well, unfortunately, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat. So I ate half the vineyard. So that experiment did not work at all. I grew up on a merino farm, and merinos are what we call grazing sheep. So a Dorper is a browser. And what that means is when they're looking for food, they just look everywhere. A merino is what we call grazing sheep. And what it means is they will only look within their feeding zone for food. And if they run out of their food in their feeding zone, then they'll look elsewhere. And the merinos kind of worked. The grapevine sat here and the bunches just hung down inside of their grazing zone. And so what we did is we ran 2 electrical wires just under the bunches. And that worked quite well. It kept the sheep off the bunches and they seemed to work well through the vineyard. The problem was, it's amazing how many grapes a sheep can eat when you run out of electricity for a day. So that experiment kind of worked, kind of didn't. Eventually we found a rare sheep breed, which is called a Hampshire Down. They're originally from the UK. Now they look a little bit like the Suffolks with the black face, but they actually have a bit more black wool, a bit more white wool over their face as well. And they're quite little, cute sheep. They're about 2 inches shorter than a merino. They're a grazer like a merino. They're also good meat and good wool. And just because of that 2 inches, so the merinos, the bunches and grapes were here, with the Hampshire Downs, they were here, and all of a sudden it's outside of their grazing zone. And so what it meant is we can now run these Hampshire Downs underneath the vineyard for the entire growing season. And as a result, we've solved our caterpillar problem. We haven't eliminated the caterpillars, but biodynamics isn't about eliminating species. It's about bringing them back into a natural balance that's not causing you problems. And that's what we have now. We've got them there, but they're not causing us any problems. I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time, but guess what? Sheep eat grass. And so now the most expensive part of running our vineyard is done by our sheep for nothing. And so they have fundamentally changed the cost structure of our vineyard from something that's a really expensive way to run a vineyard to now our vineyard is probably on par to a normal industrial vineyard because the sheep are eating all the grass. We're starting to become quite good with our sheep at managing them and how we use them. And there's a process we do with our grapes every year that we call leaf plucking. And if you can imagine, you've got a bunch of grapes hang down like this. And what happens is the leaves grow over the grapes and shade them from the sun. And we want the sunlight to penetrate those bunches because it helps us with flavor development and disease control. And so normally what we do every year is we get teams and teams of people to walk down the vineyard, literally doing this, ripping all the leaves off to expose those bunches. But now what we do at a very specific time of the year, so when the berries are hard and green and the shoots have lignified, and what lignified means is if I have a young shoot and I grab a leaf and I pull it, it rips the whole shoot off. If I wait for that shoot to lignify and I grab a leaf and pull it, it only rips the leaf off. So at that very particular time of the year, as normal, we'll put the sheep in the block and the sheep will eat down the grass, usually in about 3 or 4 days. At that period, normally we would move them onto the next block. But when the berries are hard and green and we've got these lignified shoots, we leave the sheep in the block. Because they have no food in their feeding zone, they start looking elsewhere for food. And they actually eat the first 2 leaves off the grapevine and they do all our leaf plucking for us as well. So the sheep have taken this. Now our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are actually cheaper to run than our industrial vineyards. They have totally transformed transformed everything. Add to that we got wool and meat as two more incomes off the same block. So it really has changed everything. The other cool thing about Hampshire Downs are they're what we call roaming sheep. So merino will flock together and we'll end up with sheep camps with all your poo in one spot and a whole lot of no grass in that spot because they all flock together there and they follow each other around the paddocks. And so you end up with these tracks of compaction through the paddocks. The Hampshire Downs are roamers. And so it's weird for me growing up on a sheep farm to go out and see the Hampshire Downs because they're just spread out across the whole paddock all the time. Amazing for the vineyard because it means we don't get compaction, we don't get these tracks, we don't get the sheep camps at all. It's an absolute nightmare when I go to shear the sheep because there's always two hiding somewhere. It doesn't matter how long I take to try and round these sheep up. There's always two hiding in a corner somewhere, and I end up with these two woolly sheep wandering around the vineyard. So it's a nightmare from that point of view. And they actually reminded me of the barrels in the winery. So when I'm making the Lost Flock, I stack all the Shiraz barrels in one stack and all the Merlot barrels in a stack and all the Grenache barrels in a stack. And those barrels are scattered across the whole winery. And it reminded me of the sheep being scattered across the whole vineyard. And so that's why we call this wine the Lost Flock. So that's my very long story on why we call this wine the Lost Flock. But the sheep are really fundamental to everything we do. They have really transformed our entire business structure. They've transformed our entire management structure. You know, when I've done a lot of consulting, and the biggest pushback I have from big companies about going organic and going biodynamic is the cost factor. So these management techniques with the sheep have not only eliminated that cost factor, but they've also created two more incomes off that same block of land. Now, I've started doing a little bit of work with an environmental scientist friend of mine where we will go into an industrial vineyard that's been herbicide and take a carbon level from the soil. We then convert to our management techniques with the sheep and take a second carbon level after about 2 or 3 years. And the increase in carbon in the soil is so big that we actually qualify for carbon credits. So we've then essentially created a third income of the same block of land as well, just by these management techniques. So for me, when I look at a vineyard now that's not doing this, it's a no-brainer. I just cannot believe vineyards are not doing it yet. The biggest problem for us in Australia is that the Hampshire Down breed is a really rare breed. I mean, we started with 10 sheep. I've got about 100 now, and to efficiently run our vineyard, we need 200. And I can't just go and buy them because there's not that many around. And so that's one of the factors that's going to really affect how quickly this sort of techniques can grow around Australia. But that's our Lost Flock. It's a wine that's special. I won't bore you talking about regenerative agriculture and farming and sheep anymore because we're here to taste wines. So I love that wine. I drink loads of the Lost Flock, but it's not my favorite wine. The next wine is probably my favorite wine, which is our Reserve Pinot. I know, parents, we're not meant to have our favorite children, but this Pinot may be my favorite for sure. We have so many great Pinots in Australia and New Zealand and America. They're just delicate styles, these delicate New World styles. They kind of remind me a little bit about like a ballerina. They're interesting and complex, but at the same time, really delicate on the palate. And I love those styles of Pinot, and we have a lot of them here. What we don't have here, these old school Burgundian styles, which I also love. And so I wanted to make an old school Burgundian Pinot so that I can show people that style and so that I can enjoy it myself. And so that's what we've done with this Pinot. It's loads of whole bunches, loads of stems. It's made in a really old school Burgundian way. When you first put it in a bottle, it's like undrinkable. It's bitter and resiny and actually needs about 3 or 4 years in bottle to really soften up and become nice and soft and fruity. And if any of you have been lucky enough to travel around Burgundy in France, you'll know that you just can't buy Pinots in the cellar doors there that are under about 3 or 4 years and old. And that's because they use this same technique. I love this wine. My accountant hates this wine. you know, we spend all this money making it, and then it sits in a warehouse for 3 or 4 years before we start selling it. And so he hates it completely, but I love it, and so we still make it. And it is a perfect example of those big, funky, old school Pinots. You know, if you look at it too and swell it in your glass, you might get a bit of cloudiness to it. That's because this is one of our more natural wines. It's all completely unfiltered. It's all vegan. It's some old school techniques, and it's designed to age. This wine will just age and age and age and age. And it's already just starting to get these beautiful hints of cigar box. And that's one of the characters we're really chasing in an old Pinot, are these cigar box characters. And they're kind of like, if you've ever opened a cigar box, it's like this woody smell, but it's quite a sweet wood. It's not a dry or acrid wood. It's quite a sweet style wood. And so we're just starting to get hints of that. So this is pretty exciting. I love watching this Pinot age. For me, traditionally, those delicate style Pinots are a really great match with dark or pheasant or something like that. This Pinot, because it's a bit more funky and big and robust, I think venison is a great match for this. And Jamie Oliver actually has this recipe for a beautiful, it's a venison and juniper berry stew. And I think that's one of my favorite matches with the Pinot. But big, old school, funky Burgundian style Pinot. I love it. So next we have our Shiraz. I had to include a Shiraz. You know, actually, the Southern Highlands is too cold to grow Shiraz. So you'll notice we have a couple of different labels. We've got our Creators Series label and our Sustainable Series label. So our Sustainable Series label is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. The Creators Series label is not 100% off our biodynamics block. So in the Shiraz, for example, you know, it's too cold in the Highlands, but I wanted to make a Shiraz because, you know, Shiraz put Australia on the world wine map. We're known around the world because of our Shiraz. The first job I ever had when I finished school was with a winery called Clonakilla, who are famous for making cool climate Shiraz. So I kind of had to make a Shiraz in our lineup. And so we work really closely with some growers from the hilltops in Young. We're about 2-3 hours away from us in the Southern Highlands, and they grow the grapes for us, and then we make it into wine back at the Highlands. And we just do that because it's a little bit too cold for us in the Highlands to make it. So that comes under our Creators Series wine. Shiraz is funny in Australia. You know, I've been making wine now for 23 years, and I've tried all these different techniques and all these different ways of making Shiraz. But the thing that works every single time for cool climate Australian Shiraz is just not fiddling with it. It's the most boring commercial winemaking we do out of all of our wines. We destem it, it ferments without the skins for 3 weeks. It goes into oak for 12 to 18 months. It then goes into bottle. Probably 90% of Australian reds are made like that. It's quite boring winemaking, but for some reason, Australian Shiraz just likes to be made that way. It doesn't like to be fiddled with, and it always creates these beautiful cool climate wines. If you guys drink cool climate wines or cool climate Shiraz at all, this is exactly what you'd expect to get. It is a very typical cool climate Shiraz. For me, one of the things that I absolutely love the most about cool climate Shiraz is the structure to it. So have a sip of the wine and think about where that furriness and that tannin is in your mouth. And when you taste it, you'll see right down the middle of the tongue, you get this line of tannin. And what that does is it creates structure around the wine. And that structure holds together the flavors and hands the flavors to you in a really delicate way. And that, to me, is one of the key things I love about cool climate Shiraz. You know, we look at these warmer climate Shirazes and they have beautiful interest and complexity and robust flavors. And they just sort of go, bang, there you go. And you're just like, whoa, thanks, that's amazing. And they give it to you all at once. These cool climate wines has all this interest and complexity and these flavors, but because of this structure, it delicately gives them to you and presents them to you rather than giving them to you at once. And kind of like, it reminds me of, you know, when you order a steak at, say, a 5-star restaurant or a hatted restaurant, and the waiter carefully brings it out on a plate, and it's laid out on the plate beautifully. And then you have all your side dishes beautifully laid out next to it, and it's presented in a beautiful way. And then you go to a pub and you order a steak, and you have similar flavor and similar side flavors, but it's sort of handed to you at a tray. And to me, that's the difference between cool climate Shiraz and warm climate Shiraz, is the way the flavors are given to you rather than the flavors themselves. And so that's what I love about cool climate wine Shirazes. For me, the Hilltops, Canberra, and Heathcote are probably the three regions in Australia that consistently do that beautiful structure. And that's one of the reasons why we work closely with our grower up in the Hilltops to get this wine. But, you know, I love this wine. Every time I taste it in these virtual tastings, I always think, oh, geez, I don't know why I don't drink more of this wine. I really love it. I need to start drinking more of it. But it's a very, very typical cool climate Australian Shiraz. So you definitely, if you like cool climate Shiraz, you definitely won't be disappointed with that one. What are we moving on to next? Next, we have our post-mat Cabernet. So this is actually something really interesting. And don't worry if I'm getting a little bit of ahead of you with my wines. There's a bit of a story behind this one, and so you can catch up. But when I was at uni, I was really lucky. I went through and did my uni degree, a winemaking degree, and there was about 5 or 10 of us at uni. And about 2 years after me, there was about 200 of us doing the degree. So I kind of became a winemaker before it was cool to be a winemaker. But what it meant was I was really lucky because we had a master of wine teaching us at uni called Nick Bulliard. And because there was only 5 of us, it meant that he could bring a really special bottle of wine out of his cellar and the 5 of us could taste it. Whereas if there were 200 people, he couldn't just grab one bottle from his cellar. He had to make sure he had enough bottles for everyone to taste. And Nick Bulliard tells this amazing story where he was down in Adelaide and he was walking down the street, and there's this old pub that was being renovated, and there was a big skip bin out the front, and he walked past and he looked in the skip bin and he saw at the bottom of the skip bin a 375 ml bottle of wine. So he jumped in the skip bin, he grabbed it and he brought it to uni and we tasted it. Anyway, it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the original Penfolds vineyard in Adelaide was the McGill's vineyard, and the original Grange is their Burgundy. And so this is like Penfolds Grange before Penfolds Grange. And it was an amazing wine. And ever since that day, I've been obsessed with old wines. The funny thing with old wines is, you know, when you try and describe them, the flavors they don't describe the wine really well. We're talking like soy sauce and fish sauce and composting fruits, and you think, oh, you're not selling this wine to me. There's something though, the way those flavors blend with the fruit flavors that just creates this magic in your mouth. And reminds me when I was at uni as well, I had a flatmate who was a chef or was studying to be a chef. And he said to me one morning, oh, Jeff, I'm going to cook you French toast. And I thought, French toast, cool, sounds good. Whatever it is, sounds good. So he's made this, you know, the French toast with the egg and the bread, and he's fried up that, and then he's put fried bananas on top of that, and then he's put fried bacon on top of that, and he's put maple syrup over the whole thing. And I remember looking at it going, bacon and bananas and eggs, and I'm like, mate, what are you giving me here? And tasting it and thinking, wow, this is amazing. The way that saltiness of the bacon goes, sort of matches the sweetness of the banana, and the banana-y, fruity flavors and those sort of bacony flavors and the savory flavors, and the way everything matched just created this really interesting magic in the mouth. And that to me is old wines. You have these two sort of flavor spectrums that you don't expect to work well together, but they just meld perfectly together and they create this magic. And so I became obsessed with old wines. And when you look around the world at who is known for making these delicate reds that age and age and age, and all the time they're renowned for these old wines, we find Bordeaux. Bordeaux reds are famous for aging really well. And the Bordeaux people, I'm not sure what we call them, Bordelais, the French Bordeauxans, I don't know. We'll call anyway. The Bordeaux Frenchmen created a technique that they call post-ferment maceration. So post-met Cabernet, we use this technique. And When we're making a wine to age, we have a couple of problems. The first problem is our fruit level. So if you can imagine, a normal wine might have a fruit level here, and what happens over time, the savory levels come up and the fruit levels come down until they're sort of in balance here. And that's their premium drinking, is when they're in balance there. And that might be maybe 20, 30 years. So if we want to make something 50 years, we need to start with a huge amount of fruit so that when our balance comes out, it's up here around about the 50-year mark. So that's the first problem when we're aging a wine for a really long time. The second problem is the structure of the wine can fall apart, which is called cracking up. And if you can imagine, if you've ever had a young Cabernet before, young Cabernets have these sort of short, edgy tannins. They almost give you this chalky feeling in your mouth, and you grippy, chalky feeling. Those edgy tannins are short chains. And when you age a bottle of wine, those short chain tannins join together into a long chain tannin, and a long chain tannin is soft and velvety. So that's one of the things that's happening as you age a wine. If you can imagine, I've got this bottle of wine and I've got 100 of these short chain tannins in that bottle of wine. And those short chain tannins join together to 50 long chains, which join together to 25 even longer chains. So I've got 25 of these beautiful, sweet, velvety long chain tannins in that wine. Unfortunately, 25 is not enough. And so the structure of that wine falls apart, and it goes through a process we call cracking up. And if you've ever tried a wine that's cracked up, it is a really good example, or it's a really good description for that wine. You know, a wine fills the mouth, and when you have a wine that cracked up, it literally feels like this crack is created in the middle of the palate, and it's just got flavor on one side, flavor on the other side, and this sort of acidy wine mix in the middle that's got no flavor. So it's a really good description. And that's a result of not having enough of this tannin structure. So post-ferment maceration is a technique. It means if we take a red grape and we squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is white. So to create a red wine, what we need to do is ferment it with the skins to remove all that, to extract all that color from the skins. And that's how we create a red wine. So that process normally takes about 3, sometimes 4 weeks. If we then leave the skins and stems with that wine after the fermentation's finished, that's called post-ferment maceration. In Australia, we play around a bit with maybe 1 or 2 weeks, sometimes up to a couple of months, but not further than that. You can imagine you've got this tank of wine and it's full of seeds and skins. And so you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank. And that forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle that wine, I'm bottling that wine with 100 stable long chain tannins rather than 100 unstable short chain tannins. And so that's how this technique solves that problem of the tannin structure over the 50-year time. The fruit level thing, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out. It must have been some crazy Frenchman that had forgotten a tank, and then he decided a year later to bottle it, and it just worked out, because it's just amazing. I remember, so it would have been about 3 months the wine was sitting in tank, and I walk out to the winery and open the sample tap. I get a sample, I smelt it, I taste it, and I thought, oh God, I have totally ruined this wine. It tastes disgusting. And so I started calling around some of my old winemaking friends and some of my winemaking mentors in Australia, asking them what's going on. And they all said the same thing. Anyone who had done this technique said the same thing. Oh yeah, 3 months, it tasted awful. We stopped doing it. We pressed the wine off. We put it into barrel, softened it out, and we just blended it out. Don't worry, Jeff, you can blend it out. It's not that bad. You'll be able to rescue it. I was sitting there thinking, oh, okay, but the French textbooks and the French techniques say it needs to be 12 to 18 months with the skins, not 3 months with the skins. And at the time, Tractor's Vineyard was a side project. So at the time of creating Tractor's Vineyard, I was doing a lot of contract making. I was doing lot of consulting, and I was kind of a bit bored with that same commercial winemaking. And so I started Tractors Vineyard, mainly to keep me interested about winemaking, to try some new techniques to make wines the way I want to drink them. And so I didn't have that real pressure of cash flow on top of me. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna do what the French say to do, and just see how it turns out. And I waited 12 months. It didn't taste that much better. And I waited 18 months. It softened out, and I'd put into oak for 18 months, and I put in a bottle. And I remember bottling it going, am I making the right decision here? It's not tasting that great. Am I about to end up with pallets and pallets of wine that I can't drink? Well, I guess we'll try and we'll just do it and see. So I bottled it. And then I tasted it. And it was about 18 months in bottle, out of nowhere, it was like, bang, all these fruit flavors came out. And it was incredible. The fruit was so intense. It was like a Sauvignon Blanc to me. It was crazy intense. Cassis and tomato leaf and capsicum characters in this wine. And it was, excuse me, it was super, super fruity. And it was amazing. These characters came from nowhere. So normally when you make a wine and ferment a wine, like that Pinot Gris, for example, I talk about apple flavors and pear flavors. At certain times of the ferment, those flavors become really enhanced and we can really taste them. As the wine goes down to the end of the ferment, we've at various stages really tasted these different fruit flavors at the end, which sort of, as we're making it, which meld at the end. With this wine, I never ever tasted it. We never had any of those fruit flavors. They just bang came out of nowhere at the end, and we had this real intense sort of capsicum and tomato leaf and capsicum and cassis flavors in it. And we still see that now. This is 3 years in bottle, 5 years old, the wine all up, but 3 years in bottle, and it's still got really intense fruit flavors. It's still sitting really in that fruit spectrum of the wine. We do get a little bit of savory character in it. We do get a bit of a gamey taste in it. Someone's asking about where that gamey taste comes from. That gamey taste is interesting because we're keeping this wine with the skins and stems for such a period of time. If you have a whole berry and it ferments at a nice warm temperature and you don't break that berry, for Shiraz does a similar thing. You get that gamey, meaty sort of flavor to it because it's the way it ferments in that whole berry. So that's where that flavor comes from. And because of the way we're making this Cabernet with all the berries and skins and stems sitting in there for a long time, we quite often get a lot of whole berries preserved. And as so we get that more sort of gamey taste to the wines. And you often see it in some Shirazes as well, depending on the techniques that they use, if they're not crushing the berries. And I don't ever crush the berries because I like that sort of little gamey edge by having the whole berries. So anyway, this wine is doing what I expected it to do. Well, not what I expected it to do. It's doing what it should do based on what the French told us would happen. And so we're sitting now 5 years in. We still have a really fruity wine. It's got these beautiful long velvety tannins. So in theory, this should drink and drink and drink for the next 50 plus years. So in 50 years time, we can all get back on Zoom again. And I can tell you whether this experiment worked. And I say in theory because I actually do not know anyone else in Australia that has made a wine with this technique at up to that 18 months level. The highest I know in Australia is about 3 months. I know in California, they're doing some Merlots and things up to 6 months, but I actually don't know anyone that's gone 18 months or 12 months, similar to the French. I've shown this wine to a lot of winemakers and Wine Australia since making it, and there is a lot of interest in this style now. The thing is, it's one of those styles that, making a wine like this, which is designed to age, which is made to be aged, yeah, it's drinking great now. Really good match for lamb roast because of all that cassis and capsicum characters. But if you're making wine to age, 96% of wines are drunk within 24 hours of being purchased. So it means I'm pretty much making a wine for 4% of the market. If anyone's like me, one, you either drink the wine straight away or you think you're going to age it, and you put it down your cellar, and next thing you have a few friends over and a bit of a party, and you've drunk half your cellar. So I'm planning on probably in the next month or two stopping selling this wine and putting it into storage, well away from me in the warehouse, and then doing maybe a 10-year release and a 20-year release to our club members, so that we can all really experience older wines. But I'm really excited about this wine doing exactly what we expect it to do. So hopefully it keeps doing that over time. So we've got one more wine to go. This is a really cool wine to end on. So we call it 8,000 vintages. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6,000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. And if you're into history at all, there's a really great book called Ancient Wine, and it talks about how they prove the oldest record of winemaking in the world. But essentially, they discovered some pottery shards, and the pottery shards they could carbon date at 6,000 BC. And on one side of the pottery, they had tartaric acid. And the only fruit in the world that creates tartaric acid is grapes. Nearby to the pottery shards, they found these piles of grape stems and seeds, which had been deliberately removed from the juice. And the seeds were fat and round. So if I take a wild grapevine, the seeds are long and skinny. If I then propagate and look after that grapevine, the seeds become fat and round. So they knew that the vines had been deliberately looked after. They knew that the seeds had been deliberately removed from the grapes. And so it's their first tangible record of winemaking in the world, 6,000 BC. There's a famous statue in Georgia of a guy drinking out of a sheep horn, which is the traditional way they drink wine in Georgia. And that's dated at 10,000 BC. But they can't prove beyond a doubt that he was drinking wine out of that sheep horn. And so it's only anecdotal evidence that perhaps winemaking was around longer than 6,000 BC. Anyway, I was really lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. I did 6 months in Australia, 6 months in Georgia for 7 years. So this is my homage to the history of wine. And whoop, I just turned the light off. Sorry about that. Homage to the history of wine and homage to Georgia. It's our Australian version of a really famous wine style they do over in Georgia called Kinsmorale. To describe it, it's kind of got like the depth and complexity and Christmas cake characters like a tawny port, but then it's got those fresh berry characters like a ruby port, but then it doesn't have any of the alcohol. So it's a very true to the style of Kinsmorale. I sell heaps of it in Australia here to Russians and Europe, Russians and Eastern Europeans, because they know the style and they love it. When I was in Georgia last in 2002, and Russia and Georgia had this little battle, and Russia put an embargo on all imports into Russia from Georgia, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmorale across the border in school buses. It's that famous over there. So it's a really unique style. It goes beautifully well with a mature cheddar or like a dark chocolate, or one of my favorite matches is, you know, that really smoky American style barbecue. I love that smoky style barbecue with an 8,000 vintages. So guys, it's a great one to end on. I hope you enjoyed today, this evening. I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't bore you with my long stories of sheep and that sort of thing. Please, guys, do follow us on Facebook and Instagram and those sorts of things, because, you know, these virtual tastings are going to become something that we're just going to do forever now. The feedback I'm getting has been amazing. You know, where else can you be sitting in your own lounge room? Don't have to worry about designated drivers. Don't have to worry about traveling out of town and be able to taste all these wines. So it's been fantastic feedback we're having. I'm about to launch a sparkling wine series. I can't put the sparkling wines in little bottles, so it's probably going to be like a 4 or 5 part series where we look at 1 or 2 bottles a week, and then they come with a special seal on them or a special resealable lid, so then you can drink the bottle for the rest of the week before we look at the next bottles. And we do everything method traditional, champagne style, all by hand in the cellar door, so in our winery. So I'm going to be taking those sessions from the winery so we can actually demonstrate them. So guys, follow us on Facebook and Instagram to see when we do those. We also do these privately. So if you have a group of 10 people or more, we can do this again, Zoom. We're sort of, things are changing a bit. The private sessions are becoming really popular, and these sort of public sessions we're doing now, we're not doing as many people on them, but I want to make these public sessions a little bit more interactive. So moving forward, you will actually all be a bit more live, and your videos will be working and that sort of thing. But I had to pre-organize that a little bit. So moving forward, will be a little bit more interaction on these Zoom webinars as well. So guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Please, we would love you to come and buy some of our wines. You would have got a link on an email, and also there's a link and a little voucher code in your packs there. Don't get confused that you end up in a bottle shop down the South Coast. We may make great wine, but our website isn't that great. So we're using their website for all our orders and that sort of thing. So don't get confused by that. But guys, thanks very much. I'm going to leave you now. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm actually I'll mute out, but I'll leave my chat on for a little bit longer. So if anyone has some questions they want to ask afterwards or any feedback, I'd love to hear it on the chat. So guys, thank you very much for joining me today. Please enjoy the wines, and I hope you're all safe and looking after each other. And who knows, one day you might be able to come and visit us in the Highlands sometime. But in the meantime, we're going to do plenty more of these virtual tastings. So guys, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday evening. I'll see you later, and I'll keep my chat on so you can chat on the typing chat if you have any questions. See you later, guys.